When the new Star Wars movies were coming out, I had originally missed Rogue One. After 7, 8, and 9 coming out, Star Wars hitting the big screens, the hype was real, everything was going on about it. I watched Episode 7 and thought it was alright. Modern rehash of Episode 4. But when 8 came out, I realized that the producers and showrunners didn't really like Star Wars. Or at least the ones who were in charge of that didn't seem to like Star Wars, or even like what the originals were about, which is what, I liked. And at that point, I was ready to give up. And then, you have the greatest line in the history of cinema was written.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And I decided that was enough for me. I never thought George Lucas was a great dialogue writer, but when you compare it with some of the stuff coming out, he's basically William Shakespeare. He's a masterclass compared to these, poor amateurs. And I didn't really care to watch any more of the modern Star Wars movies, and so I missed Rogue One. And then later I heard about Andor, and I'd heard it was really good. And I was hearing certain things come out, and I was like, wow, this sounds really interesting. I'll give it a shot. I love the Star Wars world. It's such a good world that for some reason has attracted, a lot of mediocrity and a lot of really bad writing. And so I gave it a shot, and I was sucked in. It was everything the Star Wars universe had to offer was finally being taken advantage of, and we were finally getting a real story here. And so I watched Andor Season 1, finished it, and then on to Andor Season 2 recently, and then directly into Rogue One. And for my reaction to Rogue One is I'm a little torn, and it was really trying to do something different that I really appreciated. It's taking a risk. It's trying to tell a story that hasn't really been seen in the normal Star Wars universe. However, coming directly off of Andor, the writing and everything feels definitely like a step down. So I'm torn. And let me know what you think in the comments below. After watching Andor, what are your thoughts on Rogue One? Does it hold up? And so this is what, this is my dilemma. On one end, it's a step down from Andor. On the other, it's miles better than the new trilogy that comes out. It avoids all the silliness, and even something in the prequels, it really kind of adds a gritty reality to it. It's trying to it. And maybe that's what makes it more frustrating, is that it's so close to being really phenomenal. I really want Tony Gilroy, I think the lead writer, to redo Rogue One completely, building off everything created in Andor. If he had had the chance now on the other end to completely remake Rogue One, would he do it, and what would it look like? Because there's so many moments in Rogue One that are so good, that really pull you in and kind of show off what the Star Wars world can do. The Darth Vader scene at the end of the movie is just completely fantastic. It's amazing. I love it. You understand the power of a Force user from the perspective of a regular soldier better than ever before. All these other Star Wars movies, we've had the luxury of having a Jedi or a hero as the central character, somebody who can be that lone warrior against the thousands and thousands of enemies. But here, we're hunted through space by this looming ominous figure of Darth Vader, who's chasing after us, who's just one guy who can just slaughter, soldier after soldier after soldier, and this is the reason why it's so frustrating, though, because you have this build up for Darth Vader, and then you have scenes like this with the same Vader.
Be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director.
And it really pulled me out of the story. If I'm supposed to take Darth Vader serious, as a serious and menacing, figure, and feel horror and fear when he shows up, why does the movie undercut itself? It's a good laugh, but it breaks the sincerity. Take a look at this scene that it's directly referencing.
Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data tapes, or given you clairvoyance enough to find the rebels' hidden fort.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Enough of this. Vader, release him.
As you wish.
He's supposed to be menacing. He's the villain. We're supposed to fear him. We're supposed to fear him in the way that the Empire's own soldiers do. and the story shouldn't take away from it, shouldn't undercut it. It also takes away from Krennic. We should be afraid of Krennic and what he can do, but in this scene, he's humiliated. There's this undercutting from here. He's getting a dressing down. I get that part, but he's just getting completely manhandled. The scene in Andor on the other side, where you can see with him and Mira, is fantastic, because you can see he controls power, and he has this aura of authority, and he can just use people and do whatever he wants. And there's this almost this fear that you put in as you realize that Mira, she has no agency over herself, her body, her future, anything. She has no idea what's going to happen to her. They can do whatever they want. And it just puts you in this tense moment as you realize what's at stake here. And I think this is where it gets why, initially when I finished Rogue One, I was pretty critical of it, because it feels like it's trying to get somewhere and do something that most Star Wars movies have never even tried to do. But then it undercuts itself, it shoots itself in the foot. The whole Vader, force choking the guy for laughs. Despite that, the Vader scene at the end still works. But imagine if the movie had tried even harder to build this looming threat of Darth Vader throughout the movie. The rebellion has just begun. It's beginning to attract the full attention of the Emperor and Vader. And we, the audience, know that Vader is coming. He's coming, and it will be devastating. And let that add to the tension. They're hearing whispers and rumors of this guy, what he can do. Because again, information, the Empire can control information, and we don't know. The Empire, is so huge that maybe they don't have that sort of firsthand experience with Darth Vader that other places has. Imagine the rebellion is talking about, the mysterious rumors behind this weapon and this warrior who they've heard stories of that's capable of killing hundreds, or maybe he's even killed thousands. It would be great to build this tension up, and because as you're building up this mystery and everything like that, he's coming. We, the audience, know. Let us see the power of the Empire and the power of the Force wielded by, an elite Sith warrior through the eyes of a normal soldier, people who can't deflect bullets. So when Vader appears, he's this invincible, terrifying killer who just slaughters everyone before him. It would be perfect. The other thing that makes it such a stark contrast is that the Empire feels so different going from Andor to Rogue One. In Rogue One, the Empire doesn't really seem to know what the rebels are doing or have really any indication of where they're at or getting ready to do. They fly away and attack Kafrene without the Empire sensing it at all, without having scouts, without having anything. It's just surprise, compared to in Andor, where you have this feeling that the Empire is everywhere. They're just constantly looking for you, hunting for rebels. They're always on the lookout. They're always on the hunt, and seemingly stopping and searching everything. And here in Rogue One, we have the rebel ships able to hit an Empire research facility with the lead scientist and all of his sad, depressed looking engineers. And the Empire doesn't know the rebels are coming. This is the equivalent of Russia flying, airplanes over the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, I think. And the United States not realizing anything until they're shooting Oppenheimer and a few of his buddies. It's like, it just seems silly. The idea seems silly. Why doesn't the Empire know? Or better yet, why doesn't the story address it and be like, yeah, on Kafrene, you really can't sense anything. And it's like, okay, well, the Empire surely would have some other backup thing. Do they have, the guy that the rebels do who just sits there in those weird little towers, who knows how he gets up or down, looking out for a visual aid, It could have been explained. It could have been easily never happened. Maybe have Saul Guerrero off on the other side of the galaxy causing chaos and being so annoying and successful, and just this thorn in the Empire's side that the Empire just, Krennic goes, you know what? Take everything and go kill him. Just take everything. Just go it. The rebels on Yavin 4, they're not ready. Our spies are telling us they're not ready. They're cowardly. They're arguing with each other. They don't have a clear direction. We can go destroy Saul, and then we can come back and destroy, Yavin 4. We can deal with them from there. We don't need to worry about it because they can't hit us. And on a small note, I really wanted to see Saul go crazy. For in Andor, we're really building up Saul a whole lot with his, his crazy antics, the Raido and all these speeches. And it's great. You get to see, the part where he's talking about, being basically enslaved, naked on this planet, worked to death. We were animals, you want to see him get his revenge. You want to see him go after the Empire, lead his guys on a suicide mission, probably get all of them killed. But then he shows up and then he's kind of like, go get him, girl, and then dies. And it's just like, it felt very underused, especially after Andor. I really felt like Andor. I was like, oh, okay, dang, Saul's got to do something really cool in Rogue One. Nope. He's just, and then he's dead. And it's like, it was kind of, I was pretty disappointed on that. And I keep thinking back to, in Andor, where they're having that scene where Cassian and Vel are on Aldhani, and there's this TIE fighter that flies over, and there's this terrifying moment because you feel really how vulnerable they are, how easily they can be found out and killed. It feels like in Rogue One, it doesn't always feel like the Empire is trying that hard to stop the rebels. Vader is on the ship trying to get the plans back, and there's the guy running with the plans who's, running through these open doors and everything like that. And we have this scene in one of the original trilogy where Darth Vader is doing force choke through basically an intercom or through, a TV screen. He's choking this guy who then dies, and then congratulations, you're now promoted. But then on the other hand, in Rogue One, we have this guy running away from him, and Vader doesn't just force choke him and keep him there until he can go up and get the plans back. It feels like he's like, I'm so evil and powerful, I'll let you escape. And it's like, okay, but then are we the audience, in light of that, are we supposed to take the Empire that seriously? If they're not trying that hard, maybe we really shouldn't take them that serious. In Andor, the Empire is always on guard, always on the watch, always hunting, arresting and combing through all of space, on the hunt for enemies. And in The Empire Strikes Back, during the battle for Hoth, it takes a handful of AT-ATs about 5 minutes or so to completely destroy, at least it feels like, completely destroy and rout, the rebel forces or army or however many people there are defending, and we're given the idea that it's a decent force of troops, or we could agree, more than 20 from there. Compare this with the fight on Scarif, where a group of 20 rebels managed to occupy and keep busy an entire base of Empire soldiers along with a handful of AT-ATs. And again, this whole base for the Empire is supposed to be like, the Library of Congress from here. And yet, so we're supposed to imagine that there's a sizable group of people, yet why are the rebels still alive? How are they able to do this? And it's a shame because I really did enjoy the whole battle on Scarif. Like, it was really well choreographed, everything, the action, the explosions, special effects, everything like that. We get to see it. We get to see each individual character really play into their own and come into their own, show off their personality, their own benefits. And we can kind of see it slowly, especially as characters begin to die, the tragedy and what they're fighting for. You can see it. So again, it's one of those things where I get really caught up, get really critical about something, but because sometimes it's so frustrating because it's so close to being so good and what we want, what Star Wars needs, but not there. It doesn't get there.
What chance do we have? The question is, what choice? Run, hide, plead for mercy, scatter your forces. You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission. The time to fight is now.
Yes.
Every moment you waste is another step closer to the ashes of Jeddah.
And this moment just really made me confused. There's this council meeting. If you look at the council meetings between Andor and Rogue One, and Andor, it's very much like, these are the people in charge. We're not accepting, any other options or any other voices from here. Yet for some reason in Rogue One, we have this council meeting, and Jynna's allowed to basically put her vote for what the rebellion should do. She just got there. She doesn't know anything about the strength and power and ability and history and makeup of the rebellion. She's also the daughter of the man who, as far as they know, has created a genocidal planet-destroying weapon for an empire that will not hesitate to use it because he's got some plan or something or other from there. And, and there's even a moment where Cassian and Jyn are going along through the plan, and he defers to her, and I'm just like, why is she being deferred to other than the fact that she's the main character? Cassian's been this hardened rebel since he was 6 years old, and especially after Andor, we've seen what all he's been able to do. He's an elite operative, he's an elite field operative and spy. Why is he deferring to somebody else unless they have some amazing experience or leadership quality that we should be looking towards? And taking a step back, the fight on Scarif could largely be fixed if there's just a moment or two where they talked about having some sort of plan and admitting and eating it was a long shot. You know, compare it with the planning scene in episode 4, you know, where they're going to make the initial assault on the Death Star. You know, they have a plan. They say, this is what we're going to do. This is the target. This is what we're, you know, this and that and the other. And they acknowledge full well that this is going to be incredibly difficult. You know, this is the limitation for this mission. Rogue One, though, we're left to kind of understand, you know, how is this plan that the rebels are seemingly just making up on the fly? How is it able to succeed against this entire Empire battalion, you know, coming at place? You know, we're left to come up with an explanation for why the rebels are able to do so well, you know, with 20, 30 guys against a battalion. And unfortunately, none of the answers are that great. And to, you know, to summarize everything, to wrap it all up, you know, Rogue One is absolutely one of the better Star Wars movies. You know, I worry sometimes that I come off too critical of it because I came directly from Andor, and the writing and characters and everything in Andor is just better than basically everything Star Wars, and basically most things written, you know, in today's world. It's just absolutely a phenomenal show. But at the same time, I don't want to take away from Rogue One that it was really trying something different. It's trying not to feel like just another Star Wars movie, because it would have been easy, you know, for Disney to do what they did with Marvel, or, you know, what they did with everything superheroes with Star Wars, where everything feels kind of the same, you know, and Rogue One is really trying to do something different, you know. And I've read snippets online that, you know, Tony Gilroy, the main writing for Andor, was brought in last minute to try and fix the script, which would explain why it kind of feels like it's the story's a little bit like, you know, toss salad. You know, there's just kind of the jumps around a lot, and there doesn't seem to be a cohesive vision. And I think it's really unfortunate because the movie comes really close. I think it's a good movie. It just comes close to being so much more, and it doesn't quite get there, which is just, it's a missed opportunity. I almost wish that they would just redo it after Andor and see what they could come up with. And I think we would be in for a treat at that point. But yeah, I really, guys, appreciate you watching this far. I really appreciate everything. Please let me know in the comments what you think after Andor. You know, what do you feel about Rogue One? Am I right? Am I being too critical, or am I not being critical enough? So please let me know what you guys think. Please do like and subscribe. Really does help out. So let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.